Well, the war in the Middle East is not just threatening for the global economy, it's already proving devastating for the environment. Attacks on oil infrastructure have sent toxic particles flying into the air. Strikes on ships have caused oil spills that are threatening marine life. And the UN is warning that the risks for human health and the environment alike will get worse as the war continues.
Fire over an oil depot in Iran's capital, Tehran, in March. The U.S. and Israel have been bombing Iran for almost 2 weeks. Apart from military targets, as of March 10th, around 30 Iranian oil infrastructure sites have been hit so far. Meanwhile, the AFP news agency counted 16 Iranian attacks on oil and gas fields or facilities in 7 different Gulf states. Concerns about an environmental disaster in the region are growing. The United Nations issued a warning at the beginning of the week.
We're particularly concerned by the number of reports of recent strikes on oil facilities, which could have serious environmental consequences across the region, with immediate possible impacts on safe water, on air that people need to breathe, and on food.
Concerns that stand to grow. On March 12th, 2 oil tankers caught fire in the Persian Gulf, here in images from the Iraqi authorities. Attacks at sea carry a high risk of oil spills, especially in conflict zones, where emergency crews may struggle to respond. These images from the U.S. military show the sinking of the frigate Dana near the coast of Sri Lanka. The result, a 20-kilometer oil slick that now threatens marine life and fish stocks, according to the Conflict and Environment Observatory. However, information is limited. A detailed risk assessment of potential contamination of ecosystems, soil, water, air, and food is currently impossible. What is certain? Burning buildings and industrial facilities can release toxins as well as fine dust. The destruction of rockets and ammunition could contaminate entire areas with fuel, heavy metals, and explosive materials, many of which are highly toxic to human health. According to the Iranian news agency ISNA, no radioactive radiation was released during the bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities. The information could not be independently verified.
Let's get more on this now from Dr. Gabriel Silva. He's an associate professor and lecturer in the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at the University of Melbourne. Thanks for being with us. Gabriel, we have ships burning in the Gulf, oil facilities attacked across several countries. There are reports of black rain falling in parts of Iran. What does this burning oil do to the air that people breathe? How dangerous is it?
Oh, it's a serious and real health impact that people need to be concerned about. It goes without saying, I think, that it's not comparable to the immediate threat to people's lives from being in a conflict zone. But particularly when you look at this black rain that's coming down or was coming down in Tehran, when you're attacking oil depots and you have them burning in such a concentrated urban environment, you're going to be producing, particles, chemicals that you wouldn't normally find in the air. They're going to have a real impact on people's, immediate health. So, there's people that will be struggling to breathe when exposed directly to it, trigger nausea and headaches. And then there are also, long-term health impacts, which these people probably aren't thinking about right now, but, can leave a legacy in the region.
Now, oil tankers are being attacked in the Gulf. What would it mean if a fully loaded tanker were struck or sunk? What sort of environmental contamination could we expect from that?
I think there's, we have sadly examples of this in the past. We've had tankers run aground and we've had larger oil spills from wells that are leaking. So there's fairly well documented ecological impacts on the region that'll threaten, their particularly, the local environment and wildlife, as well as perhaps food in the area. One of the issues with conflict and environmental issues is it's so hard to access and so hard to actually gauge the impact. So you're almost always flying blind, and to get in there and any hope of remediation at the moment is something you wouldn't even be thinking about.
Extremely difficult environment to even monitor at this point. What would you say are the main environmental dangers posed by a war like this that we're seeing?
Yeah, so you would have to look, Middle East countries that are or maybe not at war, but are suffering the consequences of this. You're talking about predominantly Arab nations and they're oil-producing nations. So water security certainly is a major concern. And one of the things we're grappling with now, I suppose, is that not so much Iran, but a lot of the neighboring countries rely a lot on desalination. It's going to be something that certainly, is a critical vulnerability to nations. And then, we have the oil and gas infrastructure as well as the transport of petroleum out of these countries. That is again perhaps a military target, but also a very sensitive one for a nation's infrastructure, and then with major potential threats to the environment.
Now, earlier this week, you wrote an article for The Conversation on this topic, pointing out that there's been growing attention focused on the environmental impact of warfare worldwide. What have we learned from past conflicts that can be applied to this one?
Well, I'd say what we know is that armed conflict does leave a real lasting environmental legacy, and that impacts the population of these countries. Where even though it's a fresh conflict, we're seeing this in Gaza right now. So we know that their supplies of clean water have been decimated, their ability to deal with sewage and other waste is non-existent, and we've already seen increases in communicable diseases in Gaza. If you look at the Middle East and the attacks on petroleum, oil and gas infrastructure, we know that following wars in Kuwait and Iran, that there were large-scale burning of oil wells, but also burn pits that the military were operating. There's real debilitating effects on returned service people that we know about here in Australia and in the US as well. If you go back further, we can think about in Vietnam, they're still grappling with the impacts of Agent Orange, spraying that defoliant or herbicide there. Yet It was a week or two ago we saw Israel spraying glyphosate, a herbicide, on one of their neighboring nations.
Right. What steps, just briefly, what steps do you think are needed to prevent a full-scale environmental emergency in the Gulf from this war?
I'm probably not the best person to talk about that, but I think we know what should and shouldn't be targeted. Certainly water infrastructure, desalination plants, but seeing any movement there in the very short term, I don't really see a way forward.
Gabriel, thank you very much for your insights. That was Gabriel de Silva, Associate Professor of Chemical Engineering at the University of Melbourne.
Now I want to bring in Mohammed Mahmoud. He leads the Middle East Climate and Water Policy Wing of the United Nations University Institute of Water, Environment and Health. Dr. Mahmoud, we have ships burning in the Gulf, oil facilities attacked by apparently all parties across several countries. What does all this burning oil do to the air people breathe?
Well, now we're dealing with issues of contamination, as you said, across air, land, and sea. Obviously, tankers or oil refineries or infrastructure that's situated by the ocean or the sea, I should say in this case, obviously has the risk of having these oil spills, which was just reported on. And of course, that has a direct effect on marine life. But also when you think about impact of air quality, right? So we saw those gigantic black plumes over Iran. Now you're shifting to a public health issue. People are inhaling these vapors that are toxic. That's going to cause increase in respiratory illness, and if untreated, of course, could lead to fatalities. The other aspect of oil refineries or oil-producing infrastructure that's being struck is not just if it spills, obviously, over the sea. We've talked about those tankers, but if it does cause a huge oil spill over land, now we can see some contamination into the soil. Obviously, that's detrimental in terms of plant life, wildlife that feeds on it. But even more alarming, or it's all alarming really, but even more alarming concern is what if that oil leak or spill infiltrates deeper into the soil? Now you're starting to impact groundwater, which, as you know, is a very finite resource in the region.
We're going to come to water in a moment, but first, tanker movements through the Gulf have been repeatedly disrupted, and some attacks have come dangerously close to loaded vessels. If an oil tanker was severely damaged or sunk, what level of environmental contamination could we expect? Would it be like the Exxon Valdez or Brent Spar, previous oil disasters that we've experienced?
Yeah, well, the extent of the contamination really also depends on what the vessel is carrying and how much of it. So at a very basic minimum, if it's just the vessel itself, the debris is going to cause a lot of issues in terms of physically impacting marine life. There's coral reefs, not just in terms of fisheries, which is a huge component of food security in the region, very dependent on fish as a food supply. But then when you add to it potential toxic elements like vessels that are carrying oil, heavy metals, now you're not just causing damage, but you're accelerating the fatalities of these fish species, and then that obviously cascades to secondary effects of food supply coming from that source.
Now, also, we're coming back to the water issue that you've mentioned earlier. Desalination plants in Gulf states have reportedly been targeted by Iran, and they could also be affected by pollution from oil spills. How important are these desalination plants in terms of being civilian infrastructure?
They are absolutely the lifeline of those countries that are dependent on it because of how much of their water supply comes from desalination, because they really don't have any other renewable freshwater sources. There's really no surface systems, at least in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. And groundwater is a very finite, non-renewable resource because there's not a lot of precipitation that happens, and artificial recharge into those aquifers doesn't happen at a robust level to sort of mitigate the excessive pumping. So when you strike the desalination infrastructure, now you're really affecting those countries' abilities to leverage water, not just for civilian needs in terms of human consumption, residential use, etc., but also for their socioeconomic capacity to grow and thrive. Water is an input into things like energy production. It's an input into food security. It's an input into industrial growth, manufacturing, etc. So there's first level, second level, third level effects that are hugely detrimental to civilian populations.
Now, what can be done to protect these resources?
Well, there's the acute response, right? So I don't think a lot of folks anticipated that improving water security in the region would also include mitigating against direct military attack. I think that's sort of a new threat to consider. But the region itself, to be fair, has long grappled with this idea of how to improve their water security and their water reliability because it is a naturally arid and hot region with limited freshwater resources. Hence why they've leveraged desalination heavily and quite early because of the absence of other supplies. And there's exploration to other technologies that look towards improving their water resources reliability. Wastewater reuse, water recycling is a growing component. It's still quite small in terms of a water source for those countries, but that's an element, as well as looking at other technologies that look to either increase water resources from available supply or actually more effectively to improve water efficiency, to reduce the water footprint of those water uses, whether it's coming from sectors like agriculture or industry, or even the much smaller human footprint of drinking water needs. But now when you factor in infrastructure being directly attacked, that completely changes the calculus on how to respond more effectively to that. And I think that's an ongoing issue to be resolved.
Mohammed Mahmood there, the United Nations University Institute of Water, Environment and Health. Many thanks.
Thank you.